welcome to the Cape Cod Technology Council's first Friday on the second Friday this month, because I'm sure you were all busy on July 3rd getting ready for the holiday weekend. I'm Bert Jackson, CEO of the Tech Council. I want to welcome you all here today. We've got Jeanne LeClair from the Mass Life Sciences Center. It's going to be an interesting talk, and Ed is going to be our moderator today. So I'll turn it over to Ed and let you introduce our speaker for today. Ed?
Well, thank you, Bert. Yeah, just on logistics, for those who've attended before, we'll have a break about midway through, and I'll coordinate the questions. So all questions should go into the chat session, and I'll try to organize those. And then we'll also have we'll try to leave some time at the end for questions as well. But we're really excited to have Jeanne LeClair today. She's the Director of Business Development at the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center, which is really a gem in the Commonwealth. They have the modest goal of being the hub of the world's life sciences ecosystem. So I think Jeanne's got a lot to pack into today's presentation. Just a couple things about Jeanne on her official bio. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Boston University, a master's degree in public policy, and an MBA from Brandeis University. So you'd think with those impressive Massachusetts credentials, she'd been here, for quite a while, but she's actually from a small town outside of Missouri. Probably a great topic for another talk, because I think when you hear small, I think, Jeanne, it's less than 500 people, so very small. But anyway, we're really excited to have you, and looking forward to hearing more about the Life Sciences Center. So Jeanne, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Ed. Thanks everyone for having me. Yes, my hometown, Clarksville, Missouri, is 485 as of the most recent census. It was, I think, 475 when I was there. So I'm very excited to be speaking to you today. I'm going to share my screen and include my slides. It's really great to see such an interesting mix of folks here today. I see some cool tech people, some business owners, as well as some students, which is really exciting. So hopefully I'm covering all the material that's of interest to all of you. But like they said, there will be an opportunity for questions. So I'm excited to take some of those as well. Just a heads up, I can't see the chat right now. So if, as I'm going through the presentation, you have questions in the chat, I'll get to them afterward. I think also our moderator will take care of them as well. So I'm the Director of Business Development for the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center. Some of you may have heard of it, but for those of you that haven't, it's a quasi-public agency. So essentially we are the funding arm of the Massachusetts state government when it comes to biotech, life sciences, encouraging that not only through supporting biotech businesses, but also through supporting the entire industry ecosystem. And that includes workforce development, which is why we also fund STEM programs, and we love to work with schools, public schools, as well as community college systems, vocational schools, and doing what we can to create public-private partnerships with our excellent universities, as well as our Massachusetts UMass system. So we not only are interested in economic development, but also making strategic investments that encourage that ecosystem to stay dynamic and stay, as Ed mentioned, #1 in the world. That is bragging rights that we have on a few different metrics. I do a lot of global conferences. I talk to companies all over the world that are considering expanding or growing. They're looking at maybe their first presence in the US. Maybe they're coming from Korea or China or Germany or the UK, or the Netherlands most recently. Lots of interest from the Netherlands. And what they're looking for are places where they know that they can continue to grow their business successfully, places where they know that they'll be sort of in the middle of what's happening in terms of innovation and science and collaboration. So a lot of what we have to offer there are programs that we support. So we're making sure that there's plenty of support for startups and seed funding for early stage companies, because in many cases, that's where the cutting edge innovation is happening. We're also looking to support job growth from that economic development standpoint. Companies are always interested in making sure that there's a workforce that's not only available from a quantity perspective, but also a workforce that's qualified and can definitely do the work that they need. So we have several different programs running throughout the year that I'll get into a little bit, but I'll always sort of bring it back to this focus on the workforce development piece and sort of how students and schools and small companies and folks who are just interested can sort of feel involved and included in that process, because it really does take the entire ecosystem to make it the success that it is today, and hopefully will continue to be in the future. So part of the pitch that I give when I'm talking to companies about Massachusetts includes this slide. So just in case you weren't aware of it already, as I think everyone here is living in Massachusetts currently, but sometimes when you live in a place, you don't necessarily know everything about it or appreciate what makes it so special. So Massachusetts is home to 18 of the 20 largest biotech and pharma companies. And in many cases, that can be very attractive to other kinds of investment, other kinds of development, because they want to be where all of the main players are. And so by being involved in the Massachusetts life sciences ecosystem, companies and schools and students and workers know that they're interfacing and working with the people who are really doing that important work of, at the end of the day, influencing patients' lives and changing the world. Mederna is our most recent poster child for this. They are definitely an example of a company that has come through several of our programs and now finds themselves on the world stage, truly influencing the entire world ultimately with their COVID-19 vaccine and other mRNA technologies. FYI, I don't have a science degree, in case Ed, I think he's at a BA. That's in political science and English. I had a deep interest in community development and economic development, and that just because of virtue of Massachusetts, so much of that community development, economic development is happening in the biotech sector. So it kind of makes sense. It's really just different acronyms, but if anyone has actual science questions for me, I'll do the best I can. Anyway, I have learned a lot about messenger RNA. It is a really exciting technology that I think will continue to change the world and create new exciting vaccines into the future. I also mentioned one of the most attractive parts of Massachusetts are our universities and world-class research hospitals. So in a lot of cases, these companies, small or large, innovative, or have been around since 1850, are looking for ways to solve specific problems. So as they develop their technologies, maybe they're ready to put a drug through clinical trials, they need partners. None of this is happening in a vacuum. So ultimately, what's great about our ecosystem is our ability to make those connections and encourage partnerships. So all of the most successful companies that are operating now and hiring and pushing the technology forward, in many cases, it's because of strategic partnership, either with a university, a research hospital, or even a workforce development program. In many cases, there's some really successful partnerships happening with our community college systems as well. So we're #1 currently per capita in terms of industry investment in research and development. We throw that per capita in because technically California beats us by a little bit when you look at sheer dollars of industry investment, but they have us beat several times over by population. So we throw that per capita in sort of to encourage that idea that it's really pretty highly concentrated. Massachusetts is not a huge state. I know it feels that way when you're driving all the way from the Cape to the Berkshires. But ultimately, we have a lot of really smart people doing some really exciting things and funding some really great research with some really exciting growing companies in a relatively small area. When you compare it to other places like California, our other competitive states are Texas, New Jersey, North Carolina has put a lot of funding recently, specifically into attracting small innovative companies, which we love to see. Again, it sort of feels like a collaboration rather than a competition, but officially, to make it a competition, we are #1 for industry investment. We do really well with NIH funding. So ultimately, that's interesting to universities and research institutions that are partnering with companies, because it means that whatever you're working on is more likely to get funded, either from a federal program, other kinds of grants, or other kinds of investment. And then we specifically have a really great track record when it comes to biotech and medical device companies, getting that investment, finding that support on a public level as well. And then finally, this is one of our really great selling points that not everyone can claim. We have the highest percentage of adults in the nation that have a bachelor's degree and advanced degrees. So when it comes to workforce development, especially right now, finding the right workforce is pretty much the #1 challenge, the #1 factor that many companies are struggling with, and not just in life sciences, but across multiple industries. So being able to talk about how educated our workforce is and how well trained is a really important draw, even if at the end of the day, maybe North Carolina is offering more tax incentive money to come operate in the research triangle. Ultimately, Massachusetts sort of sometimes wins those battles because of the case we can make for our really strong workforce. And that starts with, again, for the students on the call, that starts with students, that starts with really great STEM programs, that starts with encouraging the enthusiasm and the interest in STEM and life sciences at the middle and high school levels. So all the way up through, just know that part of the success of our state is coming from you guys. In Massachusetts, we really pride ourselves on all working together. So there's so many different organizations and so many different state agencies that are interested in life sciences and have that as part of their mission and part of their focus. So we at the Mass Life Sciences Center support investment programs as well as STEM funding, et cetera. But all of these other organizations you see work with us to do some of that. So I won't necessarily go through each one, but it's sort of to communicate that there's a really successful web and a network. We all talk to each other all the time. So if at any point you hear of any of these organizations running a program you're interested in, or that you think your school could benefit from, or that your business could participate in, we like to say that if you call one of us, you've called all of us. So if we hear of anyone that might be a perfect candidate for any of our programs, we are immediately on the phone or on the email with the person that we talk to at the other entity. So hopefully through this relatively supportive and very strong network, we can find a way to get you the support that you need. So just talk briefly about our various funding programs so that you know where most of our money is going to, and then I'll mention how STEM fits into that. We have a tax incentive program. Many of the states that have really successful life science clusters do this. And essentially, if you're not familiar with tax incentives in general, it's basically a credit that companies can see as an incentive to hire in a state or make other investments, so that when they have to pay their taxes at the end of the year, they can claim a certain credit and not have to pay some of that. We have a really, I think, really well structured tax incentive program that is based on new and permanent job growth. So a company is not just paid for creating one job and then they can fire that person or something. They have to insist on the number of jobs that they're going to create, make that estimate, and then they are paid based on retaining those jobs for 5 years. So in many cases, we think that encourages the sort of long-term investment that we've seen. This program has been around since 2009, since our creation. And we've seen a lot of success come. It's been a really great tool to support small and medium companies as well as large ones, and sort of just create those really strong relationships and build that culture of support that is really important to companies, not just the bottom line dollar figure. But in case you're interested, the bottom line dollar figure is $15,000 times the number of jobs that they're creating. And then what's really cool about our tax incentive program as well is that that's a refundable credit. Again, we have a really strict compliance process. So there are certainly companies that apply for that, receive it, and then don't end up claiming the money, or they don't end up claiming the refundable part because they didn't hit their target. So I feel like it's always interesting, specifically to Massachusetts taxpayers, to know that this is part of your taxpayer dollars. But there is such a strict compliance process to it that it's really only realized, the costs are only realized once the jobs are actually created. And in many cases, the average salary for those jobs is above $100,000, and we do record that information. So in many cases, it's a really great tool to encourage economic growth in strategic areas. It's a very competitive program, so we can sort of pick and choose which entities, which geographies. We really like to encourage growth outside of Boston, Cambridge. I think this year it was 1/3 of our funding went to companies in Boston, Cambridge, and the rest of the 2/3 were outside of that area. There's certainly clusters, but it's a really great way and a really nice tool to be strategic about that growth. We don't just want the market to decide necessarily, because there's so many benefits to be gotten by the rest of the state that I think left to its own devices, the concentrations and the clusters might just grow out from Boston, Cambridge, and you might not see the kinds of successful small companies that we are seeing and that are contributing so much more impactfully in many cases to the dynamism of the ecosystem. So that's a tax incentive program. I talked a long time about it, but it's a big program. We give away about $20 million a year through that. Mass Tag is a similar program, $15,000 per job for a given year. And that's really meant for companies that aren't already here. So we do a little bit of work trying to attract companies that have no presence here. I will say we're kind of a victim of our own success on this one. Most companies that are in a position to use this do already have a presence at this point. Within the last 5 or 10 years, we've seen pretty much, as I said, 18 of the 20 largest companies, but in many cases, almost every company has some kind of presence here, whether it's a business office or a sales office or some strategic collaborative R&D partnership with the university. But it's a great program that's still around for a little while, as long as we can find people to use it. So we have an internship challenge program. That's a really great one that I would love to put on the radar for any students in the digital room. You can apply, and basically on our website, you can submit your resume, and then companies that participate in this, we have about 850 companies participating in this internship challenge, can go through that resume database and reach out to people that they feel like fit their profile. There's an opportunity to include a little letter. If you have interest in interning at a specific company, you're welcome to put that in the application. And if we can make those connections or introductions, we're happy to. It basically reimburses companies for hiring interns for 12-week semesters. And it's meant for companies that have less than 100 employees. We want to make sure that the support for this kind of workforce is going to companies that really need it. For those of you who may have applied to internships before and felt like you were really excited and really lucky to get it, I'll let you know that the companies were really lucky to have you, actually, again, and especially in this environment, being able to find interns, people who are really interested in working in the space that you're in, people who are interested in developing their skills, ideally folks who might end up working full-time at your company as an employee, that really adds value to the company itself. So it's a great opportunity for students to learn and develop their STEM skills, but it's also really great for the company. The rest of these I won't go as detailed into, but it's really just to say that we do have specific focus grant programs that are in specific areas, but we also just like to make sure that we're including as many people as possible, making the life science and biotech industry as accessible and, if we can, as equitable as possible. We do reward companies for their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. We do love to see efforts to hire interns and employees from specifically economically disadvantaged areas, gateway cities. There is credit given for that. So then, of specific interest maybe to some folks on this call, we do have a STEM equipment and professional development grant that's up to $200,000 per school. And it's meant for schools, either vocational schools, schools in gateway cities, or other public schools that have at least 25% considered economically disadvantaged, or for nonprofit curriculum providers in Massachusetts. The intent there, again, because we've learned from talking to companies and from having companies move here, that our workforce is really what we have to offer that's of the most value. And that, again, really starts with our middle and high school STEM programs, our vocational schools, our community college system. In many cases, the jobs that really need filling right now that involve lab tech, biotech, advanced biomanufacturing. In many cases, those are skills that do come from vocational schools, that can come from maybe a year or two of community college. These are not necessarily full bachelor's degree, private college, BU type jobs. So we don't want to make it feel like there's this barrier to entry where you need $200,000 worth of schooling to get these positions that, again, pay upwards of $100,000 a year. So we're trying to encourage and make sure that it's accessible to students who might be interested in pursuing that as a career, but who maybe haven't considered it before, or didn't have parents that came up in that industry, or don't know anyone that already works in that industry. Because in many cases, that's how we come upon our professions. We have mentors who encourage us. We have folks we know who have worked these jobs before. And in many cases, some of these jobs are just so new that you might not have that in your life. So we're trying to make sure that the schools are providing that opportunity and those resources so that, one, the students know that these jobs exist, and two, can start developing the skills that will make it so that they can get those jobs, which, again, the companies are desperately looking to fill. So that grant program can fund equipment, curriculum programs, supplies, tech. There's a wide range of things that program has gone towards. As an entity, as a quasi-public agency, workforce and education is a really big part of what we're the most passionate about. Yes, we have the tax incentive program that we give away $20 million of every year, but I would say all of us at our core, and especially our new CEO, Ken Turner, is especially passionate about this workforce development piece. So I think as we sort of come out of this pandemic world and the resulting budget restrictions that have sort of come from that, contributing to the economic recovery, which is all really important. I think a lot of our investments will sort of tilt more toward the education and workforce investments than they even have in the future. But thus far, this is pretty much what our investments look like across the state. There is certainly a lot of investment in Greater Boston, and part of that is just the high concentration of schools, as well as kind of like I mentioned, where when you hear of a job, it's more likely that you're interested in that job. Schools talk to each other as well. So I would encourage you, if you're a student or you work for a school or you're involved in a school, to encourage a little bit of collaboration with your neighbor schools potentially, and just talk to some that maybe have participated in these programs or that are developing a program on their own. We've seen some really exciting partnerships come out of this and be able to take advantage of these grants. So if anyone's interested in that, again, feel free to ask questions in the chat, but also I'll make, if it's not already, my contact info, I'll make it available, but it's also on our Mass Life Sciences website. You're always welcome to reach out and I'll put you in touch with either a school that has participated in this before, or our education and workforce lead. Ryan is really passionate about this. He's been doing it for 10 years. He really has a really great handle on STEM programs in Massachusetts in general, and not just our portfolio schools that we've participated in before. So creativity is encouraged. And just to give you a quick zoom out, I already sort of did the bragging about Massachusetts part, but just to zoom in on the workforce piece, we have a lot to brag about when it comes to our education system in the country. I certainly feel like when I talk to students who have come through the Massachusetts education system and haven't gone through a different state's education system, people are like, school, like the food, it's tiring, my teachers, it's boring, like standard school complaints. But I'll just let you know that the work that you're doing in Massachusetts public high schools is #1 in the nation, like performance wise, in terms of comparing to other states. We are #1 when it comes to the overall results of the education that our students are getting. So that work is worthwhile. It is going somewhere. It is well designed. And ultimately it's resulting in this really strong workforce that, again, can't be competed with elsewhere in the country or even elsewhere in the world, honestly, when it comes to a high concentration of really talented, really well-educated folks. And that's ultimately why so many companies choose to locate in Massachusetts. So we want to keep that going. We have a series of robust internship programs, as well as some of those other organizations that I put up on the screen earlier also support internship programs. So for companies, there's all kinds of opportunities to get those internships paid for. And that's why we like to encourage so much accessibility and equity, because we want to make sure that students know that those are available, that it's not that there's all these opportunities to get involved in the industry, even if you have no experience. If you just have interest and enthusiasm, that's enough at this point. Those strong education partnerships and training pipelines are what keep that ecosystem so dynamic. And then our commitment to equity and inclusion is something that we'd like to focus on and strengthen as we go forward as well. Most recently, we awarded $3.4 million from our recent board meeting to this STEM equipment and teacher professional development grant program. So just know that there is money out there and it is available. It's competitive as well as all of our programs are. But again, we reward creativity, we reward collaboration where possible. So just don't hesitate to reach out. We love to know what people are working on, and even if it's something that maybe we can't find grant support for, probably one of our other organizations or partner collaborators can. So don't hesitate to reach out with questions about it, or if you have a draft proposal of a project, feel free to send that over. We're always happy to provide feedback. Ultimately, it's in our interest that we're seeing high quality applications that we're choosing for. So you're always welcome to run those by us before the actual submission process, and we can sort of help you hone it or find collaborators. It's just a very collaborative process. So don't think of it as like an essay contest where you have to send something in blind. We're here to help. Some of the next stuff I'm seeing, I can talk forever and time just flies by. So I want to make sure I'm leaving time for questions.
Yeah, we did have, thank you, Jeanne. It's just fabulous information so far. And it's great to hear about the excellent work of the Science Center. I know I learned a lot of new stuff just in the last half hour. We had just a couple of questions. One was on all the statistics that were cited. It was noted that there was no mention of the the vaccination rate and how Massachusetts has performed there, and just if the Life Science Center had any involvement in that. I know you mentioned the investments in Mederna.
Yeah. So last year, early in the year, the governor and the state administration did apportion some specific funding for coronavirus response. So we were able to fund a few $1 million of grants for people, companies that pivoted. So in some cases, these were companies that had startup ideas, either around COVID testing. In many cases, there were some really exciting developments and innovations around diagnostics in terms of COVID testing. Also vaccine development. I think the breakdown though was mostly a lot of the funding and the really successful projects went to companies that are already in operation, but might have been doing something else. So for example, we saw Zoll Medical in Western Mass sort of pivot from their standard medical device production to manufacturing some PPE. That was the kind of thing that we were looking to support at the time. We really saw companies that were already here and already in existence really kind of step up and be team players. And if they could pivot their workforce or pivot their manufacturing in some way to address the more urgent need, then they did. And so we did have a specific program. I forget the total number, the total dollars that went through that program. It was called ACT, ACT. And I'm going to ballpark it at 5 million. I think it was under 10. Actually, no, we ended up at 7.5. That number is now ringing out in my head as I say the wrong one. Yeah, and I think that is part of what's really strong about, we have so much support from the state government level, which we're really appreciative of. The ability to have that flexibility to create a program that responds to current scenarios and current strains is, I think, what makes people so, maybe interested is the wrong word, supportive. I don't want to presume, but I feel like from someone who was outside the life science biotech industry, I was always kind of impressed with how it really did seem to solve the problems it set out to solve. Not that it didn't then find more eventually, but the ability to respond to those urgent needs, I think, was really admirable, and everyone really stepped up with a collaborative spirit at that point. So hopefully that's
great
question.
Well, yeah, thank you, Jeanne. Just two other questions, and we'll let you get back into it. One's a very good one, given the pandemic and how we had a lot of workers moved to remote. Has that had any impact on the grants or financial incentives if companies rely substantially on remote workers or a hybrid model? I think it's getting at what you had very, very well presented in terms of the investment in Massachusetts and the payback. So has that impacted when there are remote workers who potentially could be out of state?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question that we definitely had to answer for ourselves as we went through these programs and evaluated companies that were still looking to hire. We had no idea what was going to happen in 2020. The tax incentive applications are always, the application is open in December and closes in February. So throughout 2020, between March and December, we weren't blind. We have relationships with these companies. We hear about what they're doing, but we just weren't sure what to expect in terms of the number of applications or hiring even in the state. But instead, we had a record year. We had the most applications we've ever had, which was 52. We approved, I think, half of them, 27, which is low for us. We'd love to be able to give away more money to more companies looking to hire across the state. But it showed us that hiring was still very dynamic. In terms of qualification, if it's a remote worker and they're still paying payroll tax in Massachusetts, it still counts. So in many cases, that didn't disqualify most of our companies doing that hiring. But also a significant amount of that hiring and that employment is happening in lab environments, which have been operating. Like it's hard to do some of that lab work remotely. So that's part of also why we've seen, I think for those of you who are as interested as I am in economic development, seeing some of those news stories about, is this the end of the office and all of that, we are seeing office spaces and administrative spaces sort of take up less physical space, but that space is essentially being replaced by labs. We're seeing a lot of that, huge developments of lab space, and all of it is necessary. The demand is still outpacing the supply as far as we can tell. So that piece of work and that piece of the life science biotech industry isn't going anywhere in terms of hiring. So I think you do see a fair amount of remote workers, and I think that's great. Companies that have been able to develop a hybrid model, some in person and some remote, I think is the right way to go probably. But in terms of what we're seeing, that lab component certainly is always going to be to some degree in person, and we're seeing that play out in real estate already.
Thank you, Jeanne. That makes a lot of sense. Last question, then we'll let you get back to the presentation, is around sample curriculum specific to analytics. This may be a challenging one, as you mentioned, with your background, but they're wondering if there's any outlines for courses and those that are driven by or connected to STEM programs. Maybe just say a little bit about the topic of analytics and mapping to sample curriculum and course outlines.
Definitely. And we're happy to provide examples for any school trying to apply to these programs. We love to talk about our success stories. So part of that involves sharing that information, and the schools are happy to do that. So if at any point you'd like to see any of that, happy to share it with you. I think ultimately data analysis is actually still a really present need. So we actually offer a little bit of I hate to call it extra points, but that's essentially what it is. When we're evaluating a tax incentive application, if they're hiring more data analysts, or especially if they're promising to train more data analysts on the digital health side, imaging, anything involving artificial intelligence, that is definitely a bottleneck right now for many companies. It's hard to find and it's hard to solve. So we actually had to, I think it was 2 years ago, one of the things we like to do, because we talk to so many companies, we feel like we're kind of a hub of the life sciences biotech sector. We sort of feel like we sort of feel the zeitgeist every now and then about what multiple companies seem to be running into and what challenges they have. So if we can design a program that addresses that, not on a company by company basis, but sort of on an ecosystem wide basis, we feel like that's an effective way to go about it. So we did create a special grant program that's $750,000 for public-private partnerships. So really it's mostly been used for private companies that are partnering with nonprofit hospitals or universities or community colleges to answer a specific data science or data analytics question. So that's a specific way that we're trying to address data analytics as an interest area. I guess this question was probably more about analytics in terms of the overall look of those applications that have been successful. Happy to provide those. Yeah, go ahead.
That's probably the right approach. Yeah, thanks, Jeanne. No, that's great. And the gentleman who asked the question said they'll follow up offline. So
okay,
I don't want to
perfect.
drag you too much into detail, but that's great.
Yep.
Great information. That's the questions we have. So we have about 20 minutes left, Jeanne. If we leave time for questions, to the top of the hour, so maybe about 15 minutes if you have, or we want to proceed.
Yeah, definitely.
I'll
skip over some of it just for fun. I will stick with this one. These are specific sector focus areas that we're particularly interested in. So either companies that are applying for tax incentive or schools that are looking to develop their STEM programs. In many cases, middle and high school level STEM programs are just sort of the intro to basic either lab tech or biotech in general. Some of them have focused on the business of biotech, which I think is a really interesting angle. But for anyone who does have a little bit more of a science background and is interested in the kinds of companies that we're looking to fund from an innovation perspective, anything advanced biomanufacturing that includes cell and gene therapy, we're seeing so much interest for that and so many companies looking to appear. That's where we've seen the most economic impact in terms of hiring, in terms of creating those jobs that are accessible, but also pay really well. And so anything advanced biomanufacturing, cell and gene therapy have been really nice little economic engines for towns and cities that have welcomed them. We've seen a lot of success so far. So we're looking to build on that success and incentivize companies that are in that focus area. Microbiome is another one that's sort of somewhat of a novel modality, but there's a lot of potential that we've seen, specifically companies coming from Europe. That's where we've seen the most interest in microbiome growth. Any way that we can use that or leverage that, the infrastructure that we already have in Massachusetts around microbiome, we're happy to do, but we'd love to see more of it, considering that it's such an exciting sort of new frontier when it comes to drug therapies. Data science, I just mentioned. Women's health as well, it's sort of an underinvested sector, but half the patient population. And so there's certainly different opportunities to address not only health conditions that only affect women, but health conditions that primarily affect women. So there's a lot of really interesting research and development and investment from a business perspective. We want to make sure that those small seed fund level companies have the access to the capital that they need. And in many cases, that can be hard to do from simply venture capital or the private sector. So that's where we, as a public agency, like to be strategic and where we can use those dollars to help a company hire their third employee in some cases. That's the kind of point at which a company is maybe the most vulnerable and needs that support to grow to the next level to make sure that their technology or their treatment is getting to the patients that need it. And then COVID-19, I mentioned, this is still on our list of sector priority areas. Who knows for how much longer? But for now, for the rest of the year, it still is. So we reevaluate these about every year, sort of informed by our conversations with companies, as well as our board and the rest of our staff. But if any of you have thoughts or interests, again, happy to connect offline. We're always looking for input from any number of directions and sources. Think of these as fluid. They are not set in stone. They are not legislatively dictated or anything. It's just all of us in a room talking about the areas that we think are most important based on what we've learned. When we look, this is the part I'll kind of skip over given our time, but when we're looking at companies to support, just know that a big part of it is geography. I feel like there's sort of a misconception that all the money always goes to Boston, Cambridge. And in my former life in Western Mass, I totally get it, because it really does feel that way when you look at the scale. And part of that is just concentration of population, but you're right, it's not always fair, even when you separate it down to per capita. So when we're evaluating company applications, there's a huge preference for anybody doing anything in the West and Central Mass, on the Cape, Southeast, outside of Boston, Cambridge. And again, I think we've had a pretty good success rate the last couple of years with prioritizing that public investment outside of Boston, Cambridge, which already is such a successful cluster. It just doesn't need as much of our investment in many cases. We're still happy to support it. It doesn't disqualify companies. And again, in those specific priority areas, if we can help advance the science and invest in a company, in many cases, investments that we've made previously in Boston, Cambridge have resulted in companies that are then able to expand beyond. A good example of that most recently, I guess, is CRISPR, that started in Cambridge, but now they have a great operation in Framingham. They're looking to expand beyond. So it's not that development in Boston, Cambridge remains only in Boston, Cambridge. You see that spread out, but just know that geography is a big part of how we evaluate investments. I'll skip over this too, but just know that half of our investments go toward manufacturing. This was our most recent tax incentive snapshot in terms of the funding that we gave away to companies through that refundable tax credit program. Again, the priorities are around economic recovery for this year, but also job sustainability. So we just want to make sure that we're investing in all kinds of job types and all kinds of sector areas. So this year you happened to see half manufacturing and R&D. We kept it ideally outside of Greater Boston. Yeah, our number of companies was 78% outside of Greater Boston. Lots of cell and gene therapy, in many cases also tools for life science. So that's where you're seeing lab tech in various cases. Drug discovery and development is a big part of what we invest in. If at any point someone has questions about this or wants to connect offline for all these specific percentages, again, I could talk about them all day long, but for the purposes of this group. Oh, it brings us back to Mederna, our poster child of success lately. We had a really great quote that we now put in all of our annual reports from the co-founder of Mederna, saying Massachusetts is, I would argue, the only place where this could have been developed. And that's exactly the kind of case that we're trying to make to companies that are looking at innovative solutions for problems that either already exist or don't exist yet, or that are on the horizon, as being something that's a really sticky challenge that maybe other places where they've tried to develop it don't have the breadth and depth of knowledge and talent, university collaboration opportunities, hospital collaborators, a really strong workforce, once again, to be able to sort of advance that technology to the point of growth that it needs to be able to actually get to the people that need it. So there's a lot of interesting science happening in labs all over the world, but bringing that technology out of an academic lab and into a place, an interesting, innovative company with some combination of a strong investment and public support that can bring it to the world stage and make sure that it's getting to the people that need it. That's our ultimate goal and how we sort of define our success at the end of the day. Oh, this image is all pixelated. Sorry about that. I hate that. Biomedical corridors, this is also just to give you an idea of how it sort of spreads out geographically. You certainly are seeing big clusters in Boston, Cambridge, a certainly really strong one developing in Worcester, but this is sort of the existing corridor as it looks right now. There's some smaller clusters developing. Really exciting stuff happening in Lexington, as well as Framingham and Waltham. Yes, it looks like a straight line across 90, but again, where we can sort of incentivize replicating some of the success, we think it's very much scalable. A lot of these communities, it's just about the will. It's just about choosing how to sort of dictate some of your zoning, some of your planning, being really strategic about infrastructure to encourage this kind of growth to happen. Again, we're seeing lots of interest in Massachusetts and people who companies that are interested in partnering with towns and cities to make sure that they're hiring locally, to make sure that their environmental impact isn't negative, to make sure that they're being a good partner and a collaborator where they can. So we've seen some great success with that. Again, if you work for a town or anything interested in regional economic development, I'm happy to help, again, make connections or answer questions about how to sort of make your town or city attractive to biotech companies. And our partner MassBio also does a great job of that. They keep a list of bio-ready communities. So folks that have put in the infrastructure, have the correct zoning and planning plans in place, you know what I mean, to make sure that any company looking for a space in Massachusetts, we provide that list to say, like, here's communities that are ready for you and have space. And then in the future, what we're looking for is to sort of expand that R&D footprint to make sure that we're positioning Massachusetts as that center of convergence of biotech, medtech, digital health. We already sort of are that, but making sure that we continue to maintain that position on the global stage. As I said, we have a lot of states on our tail when it comes to that, which is great. Mimicry is flattery. But where we can sort of continue to make those investments and keep that strong, that's what we're looking to do. Just as a FYI, this graphic and these goals come from the MassBio State of Possible report, which I would recommend you look up. I'm happy to share the link to it, but it's a really great sort of roadmap for where Massachusetts is right now in terms of its life science biotech clusters and where it could go in the future, the opportunities we still have to grow and improve. So making sure that the ecosystem is as resilient as possible to any external shocks like global pandemics, though in our case that ended up working out a little bit more successfully for companies than we realized or expected. Making sure that we're commercializing these really exciting innovative therapies and encouraging biomanufacturing, and then continuing to support that expansion of the clusters and mini clusters beyond that Boston-Cambridge zone. I think I've talked about that a lot, but it's something that we're really interested in making sure that we do. Our investments we've found are just, they go further when they're further outside, when they're further to the west, the south, and central Mass. And we've seen some really exciting creative partnerships happen with schools, with universities, with community colleges that may not have had these programs before. So just if you haven't done it before, don't let that mean that you never try it or never do it. So here's my contact information. Feel free to scramble it down, but otherwise I'm pretty sure that they'll send it out, or if it's not already on the website. But feel free to blast my communication and contact details everywhere you want to. I'm sort of the funnel for all of our programs. So I'm in many cases the first conversation, but if I don't know the answer to something, or we have a program manager who can answer your questions more specifically, that's who I'll refer you to. We have a really great team of 16 people right now. And we're all really, really close and talk all the time. So between this network, we'll get you the information you need. And thank you.
Well, thanks again, Jeanne. That was all just fabulous and wow. It's, again, just really impressive how much is happening at the Science Center. And as you said, a lot of it goes through you. So I know you're a very busy individual and we really appreciate your time. We have a couple questions. And then in the section you had on geography was great, although at first when you showed the path from Boston out to Worcester, I thought we were looking at some sort of a microbial
I know
slide. It was an organism, but I get a little nervous. But there was a question related to that, is if you can talk about some of the successes that you're seeing in Worcester and then within the 495 belt of Marlborough and Framingham and Natick, so the Metro West and Worcester area.
Yeah, so I know that's really funny. This does look like a really terrifying graphic from that perspective. Sorry about that. I should have put a clearer title on it. Yeah, this is concentration of companies. Yeah, Worcester has a lot of really exciting large developments in the works. I would say also Worcester has the Mass Biomanufacturing Initiative. I always mess up acronyms, but basically some really great organizations that are supporting this growth as well from a regional perspective. A lot of really strong collaborations in Worcester. I think that, not to always compare things to Boston, Cambridge, but Boston, Cambridge has a lot going on and it's great, but in some cases they don't talk to each other as much because people don't need to as much, whereas in Worcester everybody knows everybody who's working in the life science biotech space. They've been really collaborative about creating spaces that welcome companies. There's some really interesting like shared lab space, different incubator spaces that are popping up in Worcester, and that's all kind of part of encouraging it as a sector and as a cluster. Part of the strength of Worcester too is its airport that comes up a lot as companies that need to transport things quickly and don't want to have to worry about traffic getting into Boston. If they have things that are temperature sensitive or time sensitive, having access to that Worcester airport does come up a lot in terms of an asset that Worcester has. Worcester has invested in its workforce as well. They've encouraged training in biomanufacturing, the MBI, as I mentioned. And then again, creating these collaborative workspaces so that a company doesn't need to come in and spend $1 billion building a building from scratch. There's already these sort of convertible spaces where you can come in with maybe 1 or 2 lab techs, 1 or 2 research scientists, and then sort of modularly grow out of those incubator spaces. And then there's other lab spaces ready to receive you once you've done that. And I would say for any other cities or towns looking to create a cluster, it's important to think of that spectrum of what a company needs when it's very small as it sort of grows. So in some places we see towns or cities wanting to attract giant biotech companies to just like bring us the economic development, but it doesn't really work that way. It's sort of a little bit more of an organic kind of growth. If you can serve your small companies well, as Worcester has done, then they're more likely to stay and grow there as well.
Well, that's great. And you're seeing the similar things in Marlborough and Framingham and Natick. I mean, traditionally those have been areas of development, a lot of different types of companies.
Yeah, and I think all of this is scalable. Again, if you're interested in developing this, my previous life in economic development was working for towns, small towns specifically, who were looking for creative ideas and ways to sort of encourage their own economic growth and development. And I think that's a really admirable goal, and the kind of creativity and sort of flexible thinking that's needed right now. If you're a town that previously, I don't know, had a lot of it in Western Mass, there's certainly still a shell of a mill economy that's sort of looking for a home and looking for a new industry. And it all starts with workforce if life sciences is the industry you're trying to attract. So Worcester is a great model to look at. I think they've done a lot of things right.
Oh, that's great. I also was impressed with the geography, the slide you had with all the flags across Massachusetts and the investments. And Southeastern Mass was only second behind Boston, which is great. Although I see the flag on Martha's Vineyard. We have to plant a flag on Nantucket.
Yes, yeah, no flags on Nantucket yet, I know. Yeah, Southeast does a really great job in terms of partnering as well. Some of those flags you see are in little clusters. Fall River has been really creative and forward thinking when it comes to utilizing these grants, so we love to see that. So I'd say that's where it starts. If you're interested in taking advantage of this program, talk to a school that's using it already and see how they've been successful with it. And if there's opportunities to partner, we love to see that.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I know from the website, I think there's a very large percentage of funding from the center to middle schools and other schools. I think it was like a quarter of the funding. It was really impressive number.
Yep. Yeah. And it's just because we've seen the results. Again, like, we're also good people and want to do the right thing. But when you look at the end of the day, at the bottom line, that workforce is really the most important thing to keep us sort of at our world-class #1 bragging rights status.
Yep. Keep that pipeline going.
Yep.
Well, that's great. Well, that's all the questions we have. And Jeanne, your timing was exactly right. So I'm going to turn it over to Bert for closing comments, but just want to say personally, my thanks again. Really wonderful presentation. Wonderful to have you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Jeanne, thank you so much. Makes one proud to be from Massachusetts, and with all the great work that's happening here. I think you're sort of at the tip of the iceberg that's supported by, as you mentioned, the great education system and the real motivation to have from the state to have invest in this kind of work. So kudos to you and your team for all of this. So thank you very much. We will share out with everybody who's signed up for this. We'll share out the YouTube video and your contact information. Also, if you want to send me your slide deck, if you don't mind, we can include that as well in the follow-up.
Of course. We'll
send out, and that'll go out either later today or on Monday. So thank you, Jeanne. Thank you, Ed, for moderating. Robin and Dale, thank you for your work in the program committee and getting the word out about this. And thanks to all of you for attending today, and hope to see you all next time. Be sure to sign up for the Mayflower Autonomous Ship next week. And otherwise, enjoy your time here on Cape Cod. Take care, everybody.